Hello, we're going to go ahead and get started now. Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our LaRouche PAC Monday strategic discussion and overview. And I'll be joined momentarily by Michael Stager. So as I want to thank you all for joining us. And as many of you know, we are in a critical moment in the fight for our nation against a fascist coup that has made it their number one priority to take out President Donald Trump and to make sure that he doesn't once again become the president of the United States in this most critical time when we are looking at what Trump is representing, as Michael will talk about tonight, around the pivot to develop America's 21st century. But before we get to Michael here, I just want to make a few points. As many of you know, we had a very crucial discussion on this past Saturday with Barbara Boyd, really detailing what this fight of lawfare is all about, giving some of the history and background around Carl Schmitt. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to that discussion, I'd encourage you to do that. It's posted on our LaRouche PAC website. This past Saturday, President Donald Trump actually gave a very important address to the North Carolina GOP. And I think what he had to say there really defined the moment that we're in from the standpoint that he made clear that this lawfare attack, the witch hunt, what's been going on with these, as we know now, 37 counts of indictment against the president, former president of the United States, which many of us will argue is the legitimate president. That this is not just a deep state operation. You can't even call it that anymore. That this is fascism, Marxism, communism. But more importantly, we are dealing with a fascist operation that's being waged not just against Trump, but against the American people. And as President Trump has said, he's not going to back down. People are asking him if he's convicted, is he going to drop out of the race? And on numerous occasions, in an interview with Roger Stone, in an interview during his speech to North Carolina and other statements, he's made clear that he is going to continue to fight for the American people. And we have to make sure, and our commitment with LaRouche PAC is to make sure that we, the American people, will continue to fight with President Trump, to fight for our Constitution and to put a stop to this fascist coup, which is not just happening on the lawfare and the political realm. We know it's happening around the cultural attacks on our nation, on our country, our children, and it is designed to make people want to give up. And we have to make sure that people understand what is the nature of this fight, why we fight, and how we have to ensure that our number one priority is to not get caught in what the enemy has determined as the chessboard. And we have to turn over their chessboards and define the nature of this fight ourselves. The fight is to preserve our republic. And that means that we have to make sure that President Donald Trump is elected once again. And we know that people are speaking out. We look at the poll numbers of President Trump, despite the fact that the enemy is throwing everything at him and at the American people. He still sits at 68% in the polls, and nobody else comes close to that. And so I think that we'll be discussing this more throughout. I just want to say that there's an opportunity for people to get out there and to show not just your support for President Trump, but to educate yourself in the needed solutions. First of all, as people know, President Trump on tomorrow is going to be going into the court on the issue of these indictments. He's also going to be speaking to the public at his golf course in Bedminster. And I believe that there has already been announced a rally around that he's made clear that he wants it to be a peaceful rally. We know with the FBI, with the deep state, the fascist who is going to try to run. But at the same time, I think that we know if people are in the area in Florida, where President Trump is going to speak tomorrow, we would encourage you to go out and to actually take what President Trump is doing as his vision for the country. We've been talking about this, the Agenda 47. We've been discussing this from the standpoint of President Trump's vision for his economic policies and to put an end to this fascist coup, as he's made clear in his recent statements. The other thing that people may not be aware of is that on Wednesday is, as we declare it in our country, Flag Day. It's official Flag Day, and it's also President Donald Trump's birthday. So I would encourage people, I know, to go out, either do a Trump train. We're going to be putting out a statement to the effect of join us to reverse our national collapse with a free Donald Trump, and asking for you to get behind our fight in defending President Trump and putting out the needed solutions. So get out there, put your Trump flags on, your American flags, and actually continue the fight for President Trump and for the nation, and commit yourself to getting President Trump elected for 2024. So we'll be discussing this more, and I'm going to go ahead now and turn it over to Michael for his thoughts, and we'll come back to get your questions and responses after he is done.
Great, thanks, Keisha. All right, welcome everyone. So I think everyone probably has a lot of questions and thoughts, or at least emotions, given the indictment on Friday and the circumstances of that indictment, of which we'll touch on a bit here tonight. The main one of which is that it was the same day that material from the FBI informant, who had been paid $200,000 over multiple years, his reporting on Joe Biden's bribery from Ukraine and from the Burisma gas company. Remember, Joe Biden was the viceroy, in essence, the informal viceroy of Ukraine for the Obama administration, that this FBI informant reported $10 million of bribery to Biden or to two Bidens, one of which was Joe, probably the other Hunter, to get the prosecutor fired. And Joe Biden is on camera at the Council on Foreign Relations boasting about how he got that prosecutor removed by threatening to withhold $1 billion in loan refinancing to the Ukrainian banking system. So extortion, bribery, total corruption, and that is by the constitutional decree, an impeachable, the most specific impeachable crime in our Constitution. So on that same day, they indict President Trump. And the case is just shot. And these comparisons, one thing I can't stand is the comparison to Hillary Clinton, because it's crap. It's total crap to compare it. As Joe Biden, as was Hillary Clinton, they were never president of the United States. There is one person elected by the entire electoral body of this country. There's a few hacks in Washington who get confirmed by the Senate. All the federal judges do. There's a few hacks in Washington departments. Most of them are just bureaucratic snobs. Some of them are competent. But none of them get the consent of the American people. And by our constitutional system, that places the power of the state with its limited constitutional authority. It's not an unlimited constitution. It's limited. The states have sovereignty. It's bounded by principle. But it hands that power, as it's delineated, to the President of the United States, not to the Attorney General, not to the staff at the FBI or DOJ, not to the military, not to any hacks or bureaucrats or cabals or law firms or banks or anyone else. It hands it to the President of the United States. There is absolutely no way, based on our Constitution, that Trump can be charged with anything in this regard. He was given the consent of the American people, and in every case, he abided by that. Now, I say that because I think there's one way to look at this, one very important way to look at what this indictment says. And Trump responded today saying that now that the seal is off, once I'm reelected, I'm implementing a special prosecutor for Biden and the Biden crime family. That's an appropriate response. And it probably should include not just Biden and the crime family, it should include Obama, the entire network that used the FBI to spy on his campaign and then deployed Comey, Susan Rice, among others, in the interim period between the election and inauguration. The so-called by the book meeting in January of 2017 that Susan Rice referenced multiple times, the by the book, the get Trump coup run by Rosenstein and the rest of the traitors. It should include probably the Clinton Global Initiative and the Clinton Network. And but the point is something different. So besides that, which is just that statement from Trump tells you something. And it's clear. There is no turning back. I don't like the references to crossing of the Rubicon, the idea Julius Caesar brought his army in. We should cross the Rubicon. We should cross and throw these traitors out. In some sense, that's what Trump's referencing. It's time for the American people to reclaim Washington as our capital, not their imperial seat. Because this indictment is nothing less than a formal declaration of war on the American people. COVID was the implementation of martial law run by bureaucrats and people that had a brother who was a doctor. My brother's a doctor. I know what to do. Or Bill Gates. I fund all these medical groups. I know what to do. We know with some very small people out there that really were incompetent regarding COVID. But it was martial law. That's what they implemented. Now, but it wasn't a declaration of war on the American people. All this transgender cult insanity, all this neurotic, sexual, perverse behavior going back 50 years since the Cultural Revolution, where people did too many drugs, had too much sex, got too confused, got disoriented, and destroyed their own sense of identity. The baby boomer generation was messed up. And it wasn't the working class. It was the elite white collar types at the better universities who were screwed in their minds and went along with it ambitiously. They liked getting screwed in the head kind of thing. So that's where this stuff comes from. All this cultural perversity that's showing up now is not something new. It's 50 years in the making. The so-called sexual revolution, like they invented sex or something. But this is a declaration of war on the American people. There is no turning back from this. There's nothing more that they can do. And that's what Trump also sees. He's played it nice. People wanted to, jail Hillary, lock her up. Trump, even during the 2016 race, was like, kind of tone it down, especially after the race. Tone it down. Like, we're not here for retribution. At this point, it's not a question of retribution. It's a question of letting them know they're not necessarily going to make it out of this. They might lose. They better be careful how far they go. We shoot back. Lawfare goes both ways. That sword cuts both directions. And it means that for people like Vivek Ramaswamy or Ron DeSantis or these other people, Vivek maybe is the best, most outspoken defending Trump, but he's still saying, I'm a competitor of Trump and I've got to sit here and attack, the media, the journalists and the government instead of actually running my campaign. No, Vivek, you don't. Get the hell out of the race. Defend Trump. Defend this movement. You're sponsored by some Wall Street freaks. You have no real commitment to the country otherwise. But besides these candidates, which we should challenge, it's much more a sense of talking to our fellow Americans. They're now declaring war. The same day Joe Biden's bribery is exposed, that there is an FBI informant paid by James Comey's FBI. James Comey's FBI paid this guy $200,000. He's reporting on Joe Biden's bribery. Now, this is partly how, as we know, the intelligence community controls Biden and controls most of these creeps, these turtles, these lizards in Washington, the swamp creatures. It controls them by having them so corrupt that they basically they've got the goods on them. But the same day they go to indict Trump on documents that he was president of the United States, he had full access to everything. This is not about any crime Trump committed. This is about them making it clear. And when I say them, I'm referencing this satanic cabal, a grouping of people that are more interested in their own power, whether that means reducing the human population, threatening world war. Think of this, the bribery that Joe Biden got from Ukraine and Joe Biden's role in the corruption of Ukraine, that Joe Biden is now instigating what could be World War III in Ukraine. And they're indicting Trump. So it's a declaration of war on the American people. Yes, COVID was insane, and the martial law was creepy, scary. But there is something about this indictment. The Bragg one in New York, it was just kind of, I think people recognize that. And there's more coming. There's also the Georgia possible indictment, but Jack Smith, probably a pedophile, is waiting to also do an indictment over January 6th. Now, luckily, these guys, there is a pushback. We have the video footage of January 6th. It's going to be more difficult. It's not going to be their show trial that they held in Washington last year, for primetime television consumption. This case on the documents was forced into Florida because they couldn't hold it in DC. Their own grand jury violated multiple crimes. They were bringing Trump's lawyers in and violating attorney-client privilege, basic Sixth Amendment. They were attempting to extort certain lawyers to basically force their clients to basically turn on Trump. This is a full declaration against the American people. It's not against Trump. And the question is, are we going to shift? There's a MAGA movement. The base is strong, but that base should become overwhelming at this point. Who's doing better in the country since Trump left office? Who has trust? Even basic polls show most Democrats, up to 60%, believe that there was a level of theft of the last election. People are not optimistic or positive of the direction of the country. But they have to now be reminded, and this is not something uncommon in the United States. Lincoln saw similar things with the Dred Scott decision, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. There were certain decisions that the courts, the judiciary, the satanic cabal behind the slavery system, and we're going to get at that cabal in a second, but that Lincoln saw something similar then, that this was a full-on declaration of war against our republic, against our Constitution, and against the very livelihood of the population itself. And they had to fight. It's not unlike what happened with the Revolutionary War. Time and time again, they continue to encroach on the economic viability of the American colonies. Incidents continue to happen where there were revolts and pushback. But it finally came to a head, and at that point, people had to make a decision. And even then, a lot of the Americans didn't. But as the British became more and more panicked, that there was an actual, real guerrilla-like warfare. As Washington said, if we lose this on the battlefield, and as Bob Ingram has made clear, we didn't lose a lot on the battlefield. He didn't lose every battle. But he said, even if we lose on the battlefield, we will go to the Appalachian Mountains and fight from there. George Washington changed the art of warfare entirely. Far more than perhaps Napoleon. And my point being that he recruited the American people to recognize that submitting to the British, looking for an easy peace, would be devastation to them, their livelihood. They may get bought off and purchased and benefit for the short term, but in the long term, generations will be destroyed. Now, Trump recognizes a similar quality. If people listened, he spoke at both the Georgia and North Carolina GOP conventions. And I didn't listen to both, but I listened to the North Carolina one. The speeches are probably similar. But in that, he said, in a twisted way, I enjoy these indictments. I enjoy these attacks because it exposes the enemy for what they really are. Because he knows what's going to determine this fight, and he's going to wage a war in the courts. He's going to bring in new lawyers. He's going to continue to push back. And there's some favorable aspects to him, certainly pushing back entirely on this indictment, though it threatens like 100 years in prison. But it's going to be won by the population. It's a political fight. Now, last week, I referenced the Ukraine situation, and I referenced it specifically in context that the British Empire, that Lyndon LaRouche often referenced, was considered something, at best, people thought it was anachronistic, outside of our time reference, kind of archaic reference, maybe a little conspiraphile, but didn't make much relevance. But as I mentioned, if you map the British Empire, which existed from 1763 until 1945, so practically 200 years, if you map their foreign policy towards Russia over that 200-year period, you'd find it nearly identical to the foreign policy of the United States since the fall of the Berlin Wall. That the neocons, what we call the neocons, which is actually a cult, a satanic cult under Leo Strauss and Carl Schmitt that Barbara Boyd addressed on Saturday. We call them neocons, but it's a British imperial outlook. But the problem with that reference is that it becomes a notion that it's somehow the British people. And we have to make this distinction because too many people, a lot of the so-called leftists who see the problems of the CIA and FBI and the wars, fail. And even some of our best people on the war situation, people like Colonel Douglas Macgregor, John Mearsheimer, these guys have been spot on for, in some cases, in Mearsheimer's case, like a decade, threatening that this war was inevitable. And it was entirely our fault. But they misunderstand the role of this British Empire concept. But it also becomes very clear why it's so important. I want to touch on this because that's what's coming after us. And if we don't understand this reference, then we're at a disadvantage to win the war. So let me give an example. And as I mentioned, the Ukraine policy, it's premised on a containment of Russia, a balkanization of Russia, that they'd like to break up Russia into pieces to have access to all the raw materials and resources and timber and fuel, and not have to indulge the Russian government or Russian people, but to be able to extract that on the behalf of global corporations. The same is true with China. They'd like to see China broken up into pieces. The same is true with the United States. It may be British because it was centered in Britain as early as 1688. There's a guy named William of Orange. He comes out of Holland. Holland at that time, the Netherlands broadly, was the leading imperial force globally. Colonial, slavery, the drug war, cheap slave labor, financial speculation, stock market, as well as cultural brainwashing. People like Descartes come directly. The kind of reductionism we see in biology today, the reductionism you saw towards the human medical approach in COVID, stems out of people like Descartes' kind of false doctrines, funded by this Dutch oligarchy. That's exported to Great Britain in 1688. And if you look at what William of the Orange did in Ireland, you'll understand why the Irish, partly why their flag has some orange in it, because it's still considered the enemy of Ireland. They wanted peace, though. But it was a devastation of the Irish people. A devastation of the Irish people. As Frederick Douglass said, the great American freed slave, emancipated slave, and intellectual thinker, said that the only grouping of people that can identify with the condition of the Negro in America at that time was the Irishman, specifically referencing Daniel O'Connell. That's how bad the Irish were treated by this William of Orange change in British policy. But the British Empire that grew up out of this and was consolidated in 1763 at the end of the French and British global war, from India and the Dutch and the East Indies to the United States, or to the American colonies, as well as on Europe. When the British consolidated power, it wasn't to the benefit of the British people. It was to their great harm. If you know anything of English history, there's oftentimes celebrated the great William the Conqueror of 1066 and the invasion of England. William the Conqueror was a barbaric Viking predator backed by Venetian and other financial interests to destroy what was then a vibrant Christian culture in the English and British Isles. And the same thing was done by the empire later. That is, that the destruction of the English people, the destruction of English culture, was a target by an imperial force. And the same has been done to the United States since 1945. Actually, it goes back. It goes back as early as Teddy Roosevelt. I'm going to touch on that in a second. It goes back to the 1901 assassination of William McKinley. But it's a consolidated policy in foreign policy by 1945 with the death of Franklin Roosevelt. And it's a question of, it led to the Vietnam War, as we mentioned last week. Even the Pentagon Papers, the great historically leaked documents that exposed the fraud of the Vietnam War, started on the premise that with the turn of policy in Vietnam, we supported the French colonialists in 1945 instead of the patriotic nationalist of Ho Chi Minh. Communist, whatever. He was Vietnamese. He was a nationalistic leader who adored George Washington. And this foreign policy, but the point of this is that the takeover of Great Britain by this imperial force that came out of the Netherlands. We've documented this in books, and Keisha may want to post Bob Ingram's book, who covers it incredibly well. I mean, it's really a must read to understand this history and this entity. But my point is this, is that it injured, perhaps more than anyone, the British people. The British are what today? They were a great nation. The British are increasingly totally irrelevant, except as this international center of finance controlled by globalist financial corporations. They have largely been destroying Great Britain since 1688. That they've injured the British people, except for a few industrialists up in Manchester who actually happened to be working with Benjamin Franklin and created this vital industry in the northwest of England when there was still some capacity to do that. But the best industrialists left. The Quakers were some of the best industrialists and some of the best bankers. They came to Pennsylvania. That's where Valley Forge comes from. It's a Quaker forge, an iron forge. But there was some at the time, if people may reference that. But as a large scope, it's been an ongoing destruction of the British people. The same, and I think we can all see this now clearly, the same has been true with the United States. This is not an American empire. This is a destruction of the United States. But unlike England, which has no constitution to this day, what we consolidated here was a fundamental change in the course of human history. So this isn't merely that the United States as a territory of a people become the host for an imperial policy, even if it's to our own destruction. That imperial policy looks to not only to dismember the United States, to break it up into pieces, which has been their long-sought goal from the very beginning. It's the very core question for the Federalist Papers, is can we consolidate the nation as a whole, even when it was still just largely just the Atlantic colonies at the time. But it wants to destroy the United States. It wants to destroy our principle. It doesn't identify as British in nationality, but the monarchy in Britain became the arbiter, a major arm and political face of that imperial system, as does its intelligence community, its war declaration capabilities. And obviously its control in places like Canada and Australia, which were some of the most fascist and austere during the martial laws of COVID. So how do we declare war? If they're declaring war on the American people, the only option we have is to declare war on them. There's a recent post by the same Bob Ingram on the LaRouche PAC site regarding the drug questions. It's a must read. And in that, he makes it very clear that Lyndon LaRouche in the 1980s and Donald Trump today share almost the same policy of a declaration of war on these cartels, and any nation or any institution or any corporation, finance, logistics, you name it, that are actually supportive of these international drug cartel, including people who are advocating for the legalization and trafficking of that drug. So if you're supporting the legalization of drugs under the LaRouche policy and a declaration of war on these cartels, you would be included as abetting the enemy. So if you haven't read that document by Bob Ingram, you should read it. This is a quick promo because in 3 weeks, Bob Ingram will be presenting here. We have a presentation next week on Agenda 47. Keisha's going to follow up on the space program and ongoing advancements. We're covering then the drug question and the border question the following weeks. But that is one example of how the British Empire works. These cartels are international corporations. They may not be legal corporations, but they operate as massive tens of billions of dollars in revenue, competing with the largest corporations in the United States. If you actually could turn them into legal corporations, their equity value would skyrocket. There have been periods where the direct leadership of Wall Street and the New York Stock Exchange, among others, have identified that without, including major inquiries by the United Nations, that they would not be able to survive. And this is certainly true following the 2008 panic and crisis, without the drug money, cash flowing into the financial markets. That it's a way of looting the population, looting the weakest among us, killing the weakest among us, destroying the families amongst our population, and then cycling that money back to support their speculative looting system of Wall Street, of the stock exchange, and all of the other kind of off-market dark money systems. These drug cartels have been part of this imperial system for nearly over 400 years. It's the Dutch adopt this system by the early 1600s. It then moves to the British Isles, as I mentioned, in the late 1600s. But the drug question of drugging the colonies in Southeast Asia, of drugging China, of producing the opium in India to control and subdue China is a policy. That's a British imperial policy. You might want to call it the Anglo-Dutch imperial policy, because it was a combination of those two nations which became a host to the dynamic. But this concept has to be distinct in the minds of every American patriot. To operate politically in this country under these circumstances, where they're declaring war on us, if the distinct concept of who the enemy is not clear in our minds, we cannot win. And if we do have a clear concept of it, there is, in my mind, no way we can lose, because we have all of the power within our Constitution, within Trump's presidency and his campaign, in the MAGA movement, and in the kind of the blood and bones of the American people. Like, it's deep within our sinews to recognize that this is the kind of enemy we should fight, and the reason why. Now, there are probably other aspects that we could reference in terms of how this enemy operates. The terrorist question, the music industry, the entertainment industry. But it's, as Tony Papert addressed 2 Saturdays ago and is a recent statement on our website this morning. It's the way the empire has worked is to penetrate and to destroy what we've all now clearly witnessed, that it looks to destroy the family. The empire looks to penetrate into the very inner sanctum of your own home, almost as like a ghost-like vampire who will ensue a kind of destruction of your family, of your marriage, of your children's lives, of their friends' lives, of their neighborhoods, of your work and your jobs, to break down the very fabric of the ability to rear not just children, but to raise them to be viable adults, to leave them empty inside, to culturally abuse them to the point where they look to some external authority like the popular culture at a university campus, to be indoctrinated to give them some sense of meaning or purpose, because the very fabric of culture that should have been there was targeted. This is not an abstract enemy. It's not just outside. It's not just the drug cartels. It's intended through culture itself to target the very inner sanctum of your safest locations and to wreak havoc within those locations. That's their form of warfare. It's intended. It isn't the happenstance result. It is the intended and desired effect. And if we can make this clear, that this is what we're referencing, and it operates as global corporations. It doesn't have national allegiances. Now, I think I've made my case in terms of why we've made this point for so long. And I think it's incredibly important that we continue to try to make this concept of what this reference is, the British Empire or Anglo-Dutch liberal empire, as a concept is, as an enemy, what's oftentimes called globalism today. But it's not an ideology. It's not just this thing. It is an entity which operates. And the drugs are a major component. They may be the largest, because if you don't have a population on massive drug use, we have hundreds of thousands dying every year. We have hundreds, thousands more, if not millions more, using drugs, addicted to drugs, let alone the recreational uses in the millions. 20, 30, 40 million in this country, recreational use. If you didn't have that, largely by young people with impressionable minds, no one would buy the environmentalist insanity. They wouldn't be so easily brainwashed. And that's intended. So the drugs are a major component of this. You can't have an industrial society if you have your young people getting abused by drugs and then brainwashed. That's a major component. That's a major component of Soros. That's a major component of Gates, of Jeffrey Epstein. But I want to make this one final point, that what we don't also want is a return to a kind of chauvinistic nationalism, the kind of nationalism you see today in Ukraine or in Poland, the kind of macho bravado of let's kill the Russians. We're Poland. We hate the Russians. We're Ukrainians. We hate the Russians. That's the best example of this. It can be found in every nation. You could say it's India, Pakistan, it's the Chinese, Japanese, US and Mexico, whatever. Every nation's got a history of this. These may be tensions or concerns. US, Russia, US, China. It was said by some of our friends in Mexico last week in a paper on our website, but that what we want to establish now as a dominant global system, not just a system for the Western Hemisphere, not just a system for the West or for Europe, but a global system where the sovereignty of nations is not a question of being opposed to other nations, but it is the right to rapidly advance and develop. China didn't steal our industry and technology. It was a deployment by treason, by traitors and treasonous institutions like Wall Street that shut down our industry, exported, changed our laws, lobbied the Congress with millions of dollars to change our laws, to create a globalization system that marketed free trade, that marketed the idea of cheaper goods. It's not a question of opposing other nations, because you can see the tendency from the Rubios, the Tom Cottons, the Ted Cruzes, the Lindsey Grahams, the Hawks, that they would love to turn this revival of an American nationalism into something about how we're better than other nations. We have to stop other nations from developing. That is not the case. That, again, is an imperial system recognizing they want to capture both sides of this emerging opposition. The radical left turn them into pawns of fascism, and turn the radical right into the establishment of some kind of chauvinistic nationalism. The United States is something fundamentally different, and it's a rapid capability for development in our nation, to make our nation a major economic superpower again. That's what our friends in Mexico recognize is good for Mexico. It's for the United States to become that engine of economic and technological advancement that makes us once again that shining city upon a hill. It wasn't our ideologies that made us great. It was our willing to work towards common aims of development that made us a remarkable and new kind of culture and a different and new kind of nation. And this is really what Trump has called for. This is what we referenced last week with the Great American Fair. It's what he's talking about with the 10 new freedom cities, what we're talking about with the nuclear power developments, the space exploration. These are the main questions at stake to rapidly move that. So hopefully that's helpful and useful, but it is time for us to declare war. They've declared war on us. It's a formal declaration now, and it is time to mobilize the American people to fight and win this, not just the election, which is a year and a half away. That's a long time. We've got to fight and win this now. But it also means winning the nation back, winning an idea of the nation back, having our intelligence services, having our CIA and other 18,000 other intelligence agencies in our government investigating the activities of this imperial globalist syndicate, that criminal organization, and understanding and knowing that. Because that's the enemy of our nation, and it always has been. So hopefully that makes it more clear. Keisha, I'm just going to leave it there and hand it back to you and see what everybody else is thinking, because there's a lot going on.